The doorbell rang on what had started as a peaceful Saturday afternoon. I had been helping my son Travis with his science project, the kind of ordinary weekend activity that defined our quiet suburban life. I opened the door to find two stern-faced individuals standing on my porch, clipboards clutched like weapons, eyes narrowed with the particular brand of contempt that only comes from believing you wield absolute power over others. I recognized them immediately. Corinne Mitchell, the infamous president of our homeowners association and her faithful enforcer, a tall man whose name always escaped me but whose intimidating presence never did. "Good afternoon," Corinne said, though nothing in her tone suggested she wished me a good anything. "We are here regarding multiple violations of the Oak Ridge Estates HOA bylaws." She emphasized the word multiple, as if accusing me of running a criminal enterprise from my garage. Before I could even respond, she began listing alleged infractions, reading from her clipboard with the self-importance of someone announcing capital crimes. Unauthorized basketball hoop installation in the driveway, unapproved modifications to the front landscaping, vehicle parking violations. She paused dramatically before adding, "These violations have been accumulating fines daily." Her companion shifted his weight, intentionally straightening to his full height. The movement was subtle but calculated, a physical intimidation tactic I had seen employed many times during my years working in a law office. "As HOA president," Corinne continued, repeatedly emphasizing her title, "I must inform you that failure to address these violations immediately will result in further punitive measures." They insisted on entering my home to discuss the matter further. The request felt invasive, inappropriate, and carried an unmistakable undertone of threat. I stood in my doorway, feeling a peculiar mixture of anxiety and indignation. How had such minor issues escalated to this level of confrontation? I had installed a basketball hoop for my son. I had planted flowers. I had occasionally parked my car in my own driveway rather than the garage. These were hardly crimes against humanity. As Corinne began outlining potential legal actions, her voice rising with evident enjoyment of the fear she assumed she was instilling, I heard heavy footsteps approaching from behind me. A shadow fell across the entryway as my 12-year-old son Travis appeared in the doorway beside me. "Is everything okay, Dad?" he asked, his voice still carrying the high pitch of youth that contrasted dramatically with his appearance. I watched as both Corinne and her enforcer physically recoiled. Their eyes widened as they took in Travis, who at 12 years old already stood an imposing 6'4". The intimidation tactics they had been employing moments earlier evaporated like morning dew under a harsh sun. "Everything is fine, Travis," I said, placing a hand on his shoulder. "These people from the homeowners association were just leaving." The balance of power had shifted in an instant. Corinne stuttered something about following up later, and they beat a hasty retreat to their car. As they drove away, I realized this encounter was merely the opening salvo in what would become an unexpected battle of wills, one I had not sought but would certainly not back down from. 3 months earlier, Travis and I had moved into Oak Ridge Estates with high hopes and fresh optimism. After finalizing my divorce, I had searched extensively for the perfect neighborhood, somewhere with excellent schools, safe streets, and the kind of community where a single father and his unusually tall son could build a new beginning. Oak Ridge Estates had seemed ideal on paper. The community boasted top-rated schools, well-maintained common areas, and a family-friendly atmosphere that promised the stability Travis desperately needed. The modest 2-story home I purchased had a perfect driveway for the basketball hoop I knew would make Travis feel at home. He had always found solace on the court, especially during the turbulent years of the divorce. Travis had always been extraordinary, not just in his physical stature. Even as a toddler, doctors had marveled at his growth charts, predicting he would reach well over 6 feet by his early teens. What the medical measurements could not capture was his gentle spirit, a sweet, thoughtful personality that seemed inversely proportional to his imposing physical presence. He had spent his young life being mistaken for someone much older, constantly having to explain that, yes, he really was just a kid who enjoyed video games, science experiments, and shooting hoops in the driveway. Our first few weeks in Oak Ridge Estates had been promising. Neighbors stopped by with welcome baskets. Travis made friends with several kids who were drawn to the basketball hoop I had installed our first weekend. I felt proud watching my son teaching younger children how to dribble, his patience and kindness on full display. However, subtle warning signs had appeared almost immediately. The first was a printed note tucked under my windshield wiper when I had parked in the driveway overnight during our move-in week. Reminder: overnight parking in driveways is discouraged per HOA guidelines, it read. Not a violation notice, not a friendly welcome, just a passive-aggressive reminder about a rule I had not been made aware of. More concerning were the whispered comments from neighbors. "Be careful about modifications to the exterior," one woman had cautioned while admiring my newly planted flower bed. "Karen is very particular about approval processes. You will want to stay on Karen's good side," another neighbor had advised when seeing Travis and his new friends playing basketball. "She has been known to target homeowners who draw attention." I had dismissed these warnings, focusing instead on establishing our new life. Travis was smiling again after years of tension and sadness. That seemed far more important than arbitrary rules about where to park my car or what flowers to plant. My first HOA meeting should have been another warning sign. Held in the community clubhouse, the gathering had all the warmth of a military tribunal. Karen presided from the center of a long table, flanked by board members who rarely spoke unless prompted. The meeting proceeded with a rigidity that seemed unnecessary for discussions about community pool hours and landscaping schedules. I watched as Karen dismissed homeowner concerns with practiced efficiency. When an elderly resident requested accommodation for medical equipment, Karen cited bylaws with cold precision. When a young couple asked about installing a small fence for their toddler's safety, she lectured them about maintaining aesthetic continuity. The atmosphere was not one of community governance, but of authoritarian control. After the meeting, I introduced myself to Karen, hoping to establish a cordial relationship. Her handshake was limp, her smile never reaching her eyes as she assessed me. "Single parent?" she asked, though I had not mentioned my marital status. When I confirmed, something flickered across her face, a calculation I did not understand until much later. The following week, the first official violation notice appeared on my door regarding the basketball hoop. "Unapproved recreational equipment installation," the notice proclaimed, demanding removal within 7 days. This would mark the beginning of what I would later recognize as a pattern of harassment disguised as rule enforcement, a pattern that seemed specifically directed at those Karen perceived as vulnerable or unlikely to fight back. The weeks following that first violation notice brought an escalating campaign of petty harassment that would have been comical had it not been so clearly malicious. 2 days after I received the basketball hoop violation, another notice appeared citing unapproved decorative elements, referring to the garden gnome Travis had received as a goodbye present from his friends at our old neighborhood. When I placed our garbage cans at the curb for collection at 7:00 a.m. as required, a violation arrived claiming they had been visible for 30 minutes after the 6:00 p.m. collection, an impossibility since I had personally retrieved them at 5:45 p.m. when Travis and his friends played basketball on a Saturday afternoon. A noise complaint violation materialized, citing excessive recreational noise during community quiet hours. Though no such hours were defined in any documentation I had received. Each interaction with the HOA became increasingly hostile. Karen began personally delivering violation notices, standing at my door with barely concealed satisfaction as she explained each infraction in excruciating detail. Her enforcer, whose name I learned was Robert, would stand silently beside her, arms crossed, examining my home for additional violations with the intensity of a health inspector in a questionable restaurant kitchen. My attempts to address these issues reasonably proved futile. I attended the next board meeting to dispute the violations and request clarification on rules that seemed arbitrarily enforced. Karen dismissed my concerns without discussion, stating that the bylaws are clear, though when I requested a complete copy of these supposedly clear bylaws, I was told they were being updated, and only summary guidelines were currently available. When I persisted in requesting the complete governing documents, a right guaranteed to all homeowners under state law, I encountered administrative obstacles at every turn. Emails went unanswered. Phone calls were not returned. Requests submitted through the HOA portal disappeared into digital oblivion. While navigating this bureaucratic labyrinth, I discovered I was far from alone in my experiences. At the community mailboxes, a neighbor named Alina confided that she had received similar violation notices after her husband's deployment overseas left her managing their home alone. At the community pool, Michael, a renter rather than homeowner, described excessive scrutiny of his family's use of common facilities. A pattern emerged. Karen and her board targeted those they perceived as unlikely or unable to challenge their authority. Single parents, military families with deployed spouses, renters, elderly residents living alone. Perhaps most telling was the selective enforcement. Walking through the neighborhood one evening, I noticed that homes belonging to Karen's known friends displayed the very violations for which others had been cited. Basketball hoops identical to mine. Unapproved decorative elements far more elaborate than Travis's modest garden gnome. Cars parked in driveways overnight. The disparity was too blatant to be coincidental. The situation reached a breaking point on a warm Saturday when Travis returned from the community pool, his usual cheerful demeanor replaced by quiet dejection. When I asked what had happened, he hesitated before explaining that Karen's husband had approached him at the pool, questioning whether he actually lived in the neighborhood, and suggesting he did not look like he belonged in Oak Ridge Estates. The implication was unmistakable and painful. My 12-year-old son, whose only crime was being unusually tall for his age, had been made to feel like an outsider, a suspicious presence in his own community. That evening, I held my son as he asked questions no parent ever wants to answer about prejudice and belonging and why some people judge others based on appearance. That night, after Travis had fallen asleep, I made a decision. The harassment had gone beyond annoyance. It had wounded my child. I would no longer attempt to placate or reason with unreasonable people. I would challenge these violations through every proper channel, documenting every interaction, researching every bylaw, and advocating not just for my family, but for every resident who had been similarly targeted. I had no way of knowing that this decision would trigger the retaliatory front door confrontation that would ultimately change everything. When Karen and Robert appeared at my door that Saturday with their clipboards and condescension, they had expected submission. The appearance of Travis, towering, gentle Travis, had thrown them off balance, but it was merely the first domino in what would become a complete reversal of power. As they physically retreated on my porch, visibly recalibrating their approach in the presence of my son, I watched their expressions transition from aggressive certainty to uncomfortable doubt. "Hello," Travis said in his typical polite manner, completely unaware of the tension. "Would you like some lemonade? I just made some." The incongruity of this giant boy with his childlike kindness clearly disoriented them further. Karen stammered something about not being necessary, while Robert examined his shoes with sudden interest. In that moment, I recognized the pivotal shift occurring. Their planned intimidation tactic had not merely failed, it had backfired spectacularly. Rather than escalating or dismissing them, I saw an opportunity to seize control of the situation. "Actually," I said with newfound confidence, "why do not we discuss these concerns properly? Please come in." Their hesitation was palpable, but refusing would undermine the authority they had come to assert. They followed me inside, where I gestured toward the living room seating. Travis, oblivious to the strategic warfare unfolding, disappeared into the kitchen to fetch his offered refreshments. Once seated, the power dynamic had clearly reversed. The living room of my modest home had transformed into a negotiation chamber where I now held the advantage. From my coffee table, I retrieved a notebook and pen. "Now," I began, "I would like to review each alleged violation individually with specific reference to the bylaw sections being cited." My tone was pleasant but firm. "Could you provide the documentation for each?" Karen shuffled papers on her clipboard, her earlier confidence evaporating. "We have documented multiple violations over several weeks," she began, her voice lacking its previous authority. "Yes, but documented according to which specific regulations?" I pressed. "For instance, the basketball hoop installation. Could you indicate the precise bylaw that prohibits such installations without prior approval?" Robert glanced at Karen, clearly expecting her to have this information readily available. She did not. "The regulations regarding recreational equipment are quite clear," she attempted, falling back on vague assertions. "Actually," I replied, "they are not clear at all, which is why I am requesting the specific bylaw sections. You see, before this meeting, I thoroughly reviewed all legally enforceable regulations that were provided during my home purchase." At this moment, Travis returned with a tray of lemonade glasses, his height causing him to duck slightly through the doorway. His shadow literally fell across the coffee table as he carefully set down the drinks. Karen and Robert shifted uncomfortably on the sofa. "Thank you, Travis," I said, then turning back to my unwelcome guests. "As I was saying, in my professional capacity as a paralegal, I have some experience with regulatory documentation. The violations you have cited do not appear in any of the enforceable bylaws I have reviewed." The mention of my professional background was not coincidental. I had worked as a paralegal for 7 years before transitioning to my current role in corporate compliance. Though I had not mentioned this during previous interactions, the knowledge clearly altered their perception of me as an easy target. Karen attempted to regain control. "The HOA board has interpretive authority over the bylaws," she insisted, though with noticeably less conviction. "Interpretive authority, yes," I agreed. "However, that authority must be exercised within the boundaries of the written regulations and state law governing homeowners associations. It cannot be used to invent restrictions that do not exist in the governing documents." Robert checked his watch, suddenly remembering an appointment elsewhere. Karen gathered her papers, muttering about following up with proper documentation and continuing this discussion at a later date. I walked them to the door, where Travis joined me, innocently asking if they needed more lemonade for the road. We stood together in the doorway, my son and I, watching as they retreated hastily to their car. We waved pleasantly as they drove away, though I suspected their feelings about our interaction were far from pleasant. That evening, after Travis had gone to bed, I pulled out my laptop and began what would become weeks of meticulous research into HOA regulations, state laws governing residential associations, and the specific founding documents of Oak Ridge Estates. My paralegal background proved invaluable as I navigated the complex web of covenants, bylaws, and amendments that governed our community. Night after night, I remained at my desk long after reasonable hours, combing through digital archives, legal databases, and community records. I discovered numerous procedural violations in how our HOA operated: improper notice periods for meetings, lack of financial transparency, failure to maintain accurate records of homeowner communications, and most significantly, failure to follow their own documented processes for handling alleged violations. Most revealing was my discovery that several of the most aggressively enforced rules existed nowhere in the official bylaws. The prohibition against basketball hoops, the restrictions on certain plants in gardens, the limitation on driveway parking, none appeared in the legally binding documents. Instead, they existed only in what Karen referred to as interpretation guidelines, an unofficial document she had created and presented as authoritative without board approval or homeowner ratification. Through careful networking, I connected with 3 former board members who had resigned over the past 2 years. Each shared disturbing insights about how Karen had gradually consolidated power, forcing out dissenting voices, and replacing them with allies who rarely questioned her decisions. They described systematic intimidation of homeowners who raised concerns, selective enforcement of rules, and an operational opacity that made accountability nearly impossible. Travis grew concerned about my late nights and obvious stress. One evening, he sat beside me at the dining table where documents were spread across every available surface. "Dad, are you okay?" he asked, his young face showing wisdom beyond his years. "You have not been sleeping much." His observation prompted a meaningful conversation about standing up to bullies, regardless of their position or authority. I explained that sometimes adults face the same challenges children do, people who misuse power to make others feel small or powerless. We talked about the importance of community and how rules should protect and unite people, not divide and control them. "Is that why Mrs. Mitchell does not like our basketball hoop?" he asked with the simple clarity children often bring to complex situations. "Because she cannot control who plays on it." His insight was profound and possibly accurate. The basketball hoop had become a gathering place for neighborhood children, creating connections and community outside of Koren's sanctioned activities and spaces. While conducting my research, I made a strategic decision to build alliances with other victimized homeowners. Using secure messaging channels, I created a communication network where residents could share their experiences without fear of retaliation. The response was overwhelming. Dozens of homeowners came forward with stories of improper fines, inconsistent enforcement, and intimidation tactics. A retired accountant in our group analyzed HOA financial records that I had obtained through formal request. His review raised serious questions about allocation of funds, particularly regarding landscaping contracts awarded to companies with apparent connections to board members. A real estate attorney who had recently moved into the community identified potential fair housing violations in how renters and certain homeowners were treated differently under Koren's leadership. Perhaps my most significant discovery came through county records research. Our HOA had failed to properly file updated bylaws with the county recorder's office for the past 4 years. This procedural error potentially invalidated many of the amendments Koren cited as justification for her aggressive enforcement actions. Under state law, unfiled amendments lacked legal force, rendering years of fines and violation notices potentially unenforceable. Armed with comprehensive evidence and growing community support, I initiated my methodical counteroffensive. I submitted a formal letter requesting complete financial records, meeting minutes, and documentation of all enforcement actions for the past 3 years, rights guaranteed to homeowners under state law that could not be circumvented by internal HOA policies. When the board predictably stalled, I followed with certified letters outlining specific violations of state HOA regulations, copying the state's Homeowner Association Oversight Agency. Each communication was professional, meticulously documented, and referenced specific statutory requirements that the board was failing to meet. The community began to notice the shifting dynamic. Koren appeared increasingly defensive at community events. Board meetings, previously sparsely attended, now drew crowds of homeowners with questions about enforcement practices and financial decisions. When answers were not forthcoming, the dissatisfaction grew palpable. I organized an unofficial homeowners meeting at a local coffee shop, expecting perhaps a dozen attendees. More than 40 residents appeared, each with stories and evidence of board overreach. Travis helped organize documentation into categories: financial irregularities, procedural violations, selective enforcement patterns, impressing neighbors with his methodical approach and understanding of the issues despite his young age. Koren's response to this growing opposition was predictable: accelerated enforcement against those who had attended the unofficial meeting. New violation notices appeared on doors throughout the neighborhood, citing infractions that had been overlooked for years. Rather than intimidating homeowners into submission, however, this transparent retaliation strengthened our coalition and provided additional evidence of discriminatory practices. Our strategic masterpiece came in the form of a petition for a special election under a rarely invoked bylaw provision. This clause, buried in the original community founding documents and apparently overlooked by Koren's regime, allowed for removal of board members and special elections if 30% of homeowners signed a formal petition. We surpassed this threshold within 5 days. When Koren appeared at my door alone one evening, her demeanor had transformed. Gone was the imperious HOA president with her clipboard of violations. In her place stood a woman attempting to salvage her position and reputation. "I think there has been a misunderstanding," she began, her voice attempting a conciliatory tone that sounded foreign coming from her. "Perhaps we can discuss a reasonable resolution." She proposed what amounted to a private settlement. If I would call off the special meeting, she would ensure all my violations were dismissed and that I would face no further HOA scrutiny. The implicit admission that enforcement was discretionary rather than rule-based was telling. Travis appeared in the hallway behind me, silent but present, his unusual height a visual reminder of how fundamentally the dynamics had changed since their first intimidation attempt at this very doorway. "I appreciate your visit," I responded calmly, "but this is no longer about my violations. This is about proper governance for our entire community. I will see you at the special meeting." The night of the special meeting transformed our community clubhouse into a venue unlike anything Oak Ridge Estates had witnessed before. Homeowners began arriving 30 minutes before the scheduled start, filling every available chair and eventually lining the walls when seating was exhausted. Nearly 80% of community households were represented, an unprecedented turnout that itself spoke volumes about the significance of the moment. Karen attempted to control the proceedings, calling the meeting to order with her usual authoritarian efficiency. Her composure faltered, however. When challenged on basic parliamentary procedure questions, she could not answer. The board secretary, clearly uncomfortable with the scrutiny, fumbled through bylaw provisions regarding special meetings while Karen glared at her apparent incompetence. The meeting agenda, which Karen had attempted to limit to a brief discussion followed by a single vote, expanded as homeowner after homeowner rose to speak. People who had remained silent at meetings for years now shared their experiences publicly, creating a devastating pattern of evidence that could not be dismissed as isolated incidents or misunderstandings. When my turn came to present findings, I approached the front of the room with calm professionalism, Travis helping distribute documentation packets to board members. I methodically outlined the evidence we had gathered, organizing my presentation into clear categories: procedural violations in HOA operations, selective enforcement patterns, financial irregularities, and most significantly, the failure to properly file bylaw amendments with the county. "What this means," I explained to the now silent room, "is that many of the rules being enforced and the fines being collected under those rules potentially lack legal foundation. Under state law, unfiled amendments cannot be enforced against homeowners." The audience reaction was immediate, stunned murmurs giving way to pointed questions the board could not adequately address. Karen attempted to dismiss these concerns as technical issues that did not affect the board's authority, but her dismissal rang hollow against the weight of documented evidence and statutory requirements. Board members began exchanging uneasy glances, their unified front visibly crumbling. When the treasurer attempted to defend certain financial allocations, the board vice president surprisingly contradicted him, admitting she had questioned several expenditures but had been assured they were standard practice. The meeting reached its climactic moment when I formally proposed a vote of no confidence in the current board. "This is not about personality conflicts or individual grievances," I emphasized. "This is about restoring proper governance, transparency, and fairness to our community." Travis stood beside me during this proposal, not speaking, simply present. His physical stature, which had so disconcerted Karen and Robert during their initial intimidation attempt, now served as a visual metaphor for the strength our community had found in unity. Karen made a final desperate attempt to adjourn the meeting improperly, citing a bylaw provision that did not exist. When challenged to identify the specific section, she fumbled through papers before the vice president quietly informed her that no such provision existed. The moment perfectly encapsulated everything wrong with her leadership: the invention of authority where none existed, the expectation that her word alone carried the force of law. The no-confidence vote that followed was not merely a victory, but a landslide, with over 85% voting to remove the entire board pending emergency elections to be held within 30 days. As the results were announced, Spontaneous applause erupted throughout the room, releasing years of collective frustration and marking the end of a regime that had terrorized our community through intimidation rather than leading through legitimate authority. 6 months after that transformative meeting, Oak Ridge Estates underwent a remarkable renaissance. Walking through the neighborhood on a warm spring evening, evidence of positive change appeared everywhere. Children playing freely in front yards, neighbors chatting across driveways, community spaces alive with activity rather than rigid control. The new board, elected with record participation, had implemented transparent processes that transformed community governance. Financial records were made accessible to all homeowners. Enforcement procedures were standardized and applied consistently. Most importantly, a comprehensive review of all previous fines and violations resulted in refunds for improperly assessed penalties. I had declined nomination to the new board, preferring instead to accept a position on an advisory committee focused on establishing proper governance procedures. This role allowed me to help institute positive changes without holding direct power, a distinction I considered important for long-term community health. Travis had flourished in this healthier environment. He joined a community basketball program that practiced on our now officially approved driveway hoop. His height, once the subject of uncomfortable attention, became celebrated when he led his middle school team to a regional championship. More importantly, he witnessed firsthand how principled resistance to injustice could transform a community. One afternoon, I encountered Karen in the grocery store, the first time I had seen her since the special meeting. She noticed me first, her cart stopping momentarily before she deliberately turned down another aisle to avoid contact. Rather than satisfaction, I felt a complex mixture of vindication and regret, not for standing against her misuse of authority, but that cooperation had seemed so impossible before confrontation became necessary. The true measure of our community's transformation came during the summer picnic organized by the new board. Families gathered in the park that had once been subject to Karen's micromanagement of permitted activities. Children played freely while adults enjoyed conversation without the undercurrent of anxiety about potential rule violations. Travis organized a basketball game that included children of all ages, patiently teaching younger kids basic skills while challenging older ones with more advanced techniques. Watching him, I reflected on the valuable lessons this experience had taught us both, about standing firm against intimidation, the importance of accountability and leadership, and how even the tallest challenges could be overcome with persistence, integrity, and community support. As the sun set over our neighborhood that evening, casting long shadows from the basketball hoop that had unwittingly sparked our resistance, I observed the simple joy of people connecting freely without fear. Across driveways, neighbors chatted about everyday matters. Children rode bicycles without concern for imaginary violations. This was the welcoming community we had originally hoped to join, now finally realized not through submission to arbitrary authority, but through the collective courage to demand governance that served rather than subjugated the people it was meant to represent.